So our first example of translating basic shapes into forms is going to be the circle, and it transforms into spheres, cylinders, and cones. I like to think of cones here. I have a little asterisk. They're sometimes also related to triangles, or they're always related to triangles. Some artists choose to demo them as part of that group. I like to demo them as part of the circle group because for me, they relate a lot more to how I draw circles. And they have that roundedness. It's just tapering off. So we're gonna just start with our basic circle. Here I have a crosshair. If I'm trying to draw a really accurate circle, I'd like to start by drawing this crosshair and trying to get it just as even as possible. Definitely, it's not always easy to do when you're sitting and looking at things at an angle, but if you can kind of get a top-down view of it, it's easier to get that evenness. Or if you're drawing and you have the ability to prop your paper up, that becomes easier as well. I'm going to go ahead and start by the crosshairs, and then I'm just going to, almost like I'm sketching in the outline of a pizza, where I have this wedge, I'm going to just do that and try to get it as even as possible all the way around. I'm trying to draw darker so that you can see on the camera here, but typically when I'm sketching in something, it's actually extremely light, like you almost can't see it. So I'll draw it a little bit darker today so that you can see. And I start with my sphere. This is one way to just get a nice easy sphere. If you don't have a tool like a protractor to draw one, you can get it this way. It also helps you find your center, which is going to be important going forward. I also like having these crosshairs because it begins to make it easier to translate this 2D shape. I'll outline this nicely, nice and darkly. To translate this 2D shape into a 3D shape. I'm not going to get a perfect circle without some sort of tool. And that's okay. Most things that we are drawing in this course aren't perfect circles anyway. It's just the ability to get that form in there. So these crosshairs help me start thinking of it and translating it into 3D, because adjusting these crosshairs just by themselves, so I'm going to draw them really light right next to this, and draw in my circle shape once again lightly. And then come in and with a smooth line, connecting that. I have these crosshairs. If I adjust them slightly, just by adding a little bit of a curve in the direction that is coming towards the viewer, so I'm just curving it out and back in. I'm even meeting really close to the same lines. I am just curving. Suddenly, I have something just a little bit more round looking. I'm getting closer to a sphere. If I want to exaggerate this even further, one way to find your sphere and figure out how it sits in space is to draw your ellipses as though you would cut a ball in half. Let's get that a little more even. There, as though you would cut a ball in half. You can draw your ellipses here, and then you can draw another one a little bit up and a little bit down, and then find the crosshairs here and sketch in the rest of your circle. This helps me see where that bend would go. And if I put in another ellipses here, I can see even more so. I also have these like lighter lines in the back. Those help my eye to interpret this as being rounded. The trick to drawing things and making a 3D form when drawing is that you have to give your eye and your brain enough information to be able to interpret this as 3D, even though it remains on a 2D surface. It remains flat, but we're looking in 3D. Having these curvature lines helps our eye and our brain to look at this and interpret it as such. So here we have our sphere. Spheres can also, we'll just write sphere here. So spheres can also be really useful as building blocks to other objects. We're going to discuss this more in the next class when we start discussing constructing objects out of basic forms. But just as an example, I want to show you how I use spheres to begin drawing the shape of a head or a face for a fashion figure. And the way that I do that is I actually just start with these curved crosshairs. So I'm going to make a head, and I'm going to have it looking kind of really in this direction. So slightly towards the viewer, it's a 3/4 view. So my crosshairs, if I was going to like cut that shape, are sitting somewhat like this. I know to cross through this shape, I want a line that's going to come and curve and have the most curved this direction point touching there. And then it's going to curve back out. I want these little areas to be equidistant. If you remember that connect the dots exercise that we did, I'm essentially setting up those dots in my mind, connecting them. So I'm going to draw that just over here and sketch in that line. Now my line for the front of my face needs to meet right here and right here. However, in order for it to have dimension on this axis, I need to bring it slightly forward. So I'm going to choose a point along this axis to curve as well. You don't really have to draw all this out. You can just draw these curves and adjust them as you see fit. So for example, if I draw a face, right here is actually going to end up being about my brow. Your eyes, the actual eyes on your face, end up sitting at about a halfway point. So they're going to sit down here. And sometimes I like to sketch those in at this point. Sometimes I don't worry about it. At this point, I generally begin figuring out the shape of the back of the skull as well as the shape of the jaw. So an eye can be helpful putting just in that socket because your skull comes out a little bit past where your eye is. So that supraorbital arch, which is the arch that creates your brow, comes out just a little bit and frames your eyes. So I'm going to give myself a little mark there and a little mark there just to remind myself that this is where my supraorbital arches are going. This is getting a lot more into facial anatomy than we need to get at this point. You don't need to worry about it, but in terms of an explanation for how we're going to use spheres for fashion, this is our example. So now I'm going to come and I'm just going to continue this back, bring the top of my skull back and around. And then here, your chin does not curve back in along this line. In fact, it kind of thrusts out, not quite at that extreme of an angle. I'll do a little erasure there. But your chin does thrust out a bit. So I like to give a mark for my chin. Once again, I want it to be approximately the same distance here. different people have slightly different facial proportions, and when we're drawing fashion figures, things tend to be a little elongated. So I'm adding just a touch of elongation there. Then I'm going to bring out my cheek for roundness and just angle in my jaw on this side, and just a little bit up. I could draw this in. I find that this tends to be distracting, so I just keep it erased. Then from the back of my neck, if I was just drawing the skull, it would kind of curve like this, and this would come around. We'd put a little ear here sticking out, maybe just the tiniest bit of an ear there, depending on how far they stick out. I think I have this drawn facing away enough that you wouldn't even see an ear, because your ear is going to come along another meridian, the curve here. Your ear is going to touch that. If it was just a skull here is where I would leave it, but we're on a figure and your skull sits onto your spine, and then your spine, if we just draw a rough shape here, this is literally how a lot of my fashion figures start, is just like with a rough, like very roughed in shape. How your spine sits is it actually curves in, back out along your shoulder, and then back in a little bit to sit along your pelvic bone. This is an extremely shortened spine compared to my head size, but this shape is how that sits in there. So your spine sits on your vertebrae where you have kind of a roundness, and then it curves back in. And you want it to curve back in to sit about where that line falls, about centered in the mass of your skull. So if we look at this, I'm going to put in some dotted lines. This is where our sphere is. It deviates from the sphere to jut out and form the chin, but we're trying to come back towards this center line here. Our neck, thus, is going to curve and meet up along that line. I always have a little bit of trouble deciding how I want the neck to sit. If I'm really struggling, I'll just drop a line down like that, and I'll draw it in as a cylinder until I figure out the rest of my form. I'm really drawing in a full like little skeleton when I first start figuring out poses before I do any of this fleshing out, and we'll discuss that in our figure drawing lesson, which we will be approaching in the next class or two. This neck is actually a cylinder, which brings us down to working on those. So let's work on cylinders next. So I'm going to make this spheres. Okay. So cylinders are a really, really important shape in both fashion and interior drawing, because so many things are soft and round and based off of cylinders. Even if you start with something very square, like a chair, you might have rounded armrests that are cylinders. You might have a pillow that is kind of a bolster pillow, so a cylinder. You could have a lamp base, a table base. All of these things are cylinders. In fashion drawing, cylinders make up almost like all of the major limbs, and to a great degree the torso of a body. You could start from a square base. It's often faster to start from a cylinder. Some people kind of like to draw more squares, and some people like cylinders. I like to keep everything like very soft and flowing, and thus I use a cylinder base. This will probably all make a bit more sense when I get into figure drawing. So a cylinder also starts with a circle. However, the circle is elongated. We're going to stretch it equally in two directions to begin forming an ellipses. So an ellipses differs from a circle in that it's stretched, and they're kind of just a little bit easier to draw even. I like to give myself a crosshairs again. However, this time one of my crosshair arms is going to be longer than the other. It's pretty slight. Here, I'm not drawing it too stretched. I'm drawing it a little stretched. So once again, I'm going to put in these nice curves, and they just give me those almost those dot targets to meet, and then I can come. From this point, I'm going to come from here and here on my cylinder, the little ends of this crosshair line here, and I'm going to just sketch out. And how I like to do this is I like to move my elbow. So my anchored point here is my shoulder. I'm putting my elbow in to my side and then softly anchoring, but like my shoulder remains firmly where it is. And I'm going to just draw out my lines in those just very light sketches here. Now what I need to do is I need to transfer this line to the end of my cylinder. How should I do that? The first thing I can do is also translate this line just along my form. Bring that up just a little bit. I'm eyeballing, still maintaining my equal distance here. I'm pulling this line out. I'm going to transfer either this whole curve or part of a curve and then part of a curve to the corresponding areas here. How I like to do it is what I call like phantom or ghost drawing, where I'm just going over it but not actually touching my page. Hopefully you can see that I'm not actually touching. I'm just moving a little bit to kind of get my brain and my eye to start connecting with my muscles. And what does that motion feel like? Then I'm going to sketch it in. I just move my arm. Once again, I'm just pivoting out from my shoulder actually, so that this all remains steady. Pivot out from my shoulder. My elbow goes out, and I transfer that line. A lot of times I have to come back in and just curve it just a little bit more to exaggerate that. And then I can come back in and make sure that those lines are nice and visible. If you're seeing this and you're going, it's just not quite it's just not quite translating for me. It doesn't quite look like a 3D form yet. Adding in another line of curvature can help along here. Especially, I'm going to draw another one here just very quickly. I'm looking at my top, but I could draw in these lines. Okay. So I have, if I'm looking at just this mini version that I've drawn down below, and I want to translate, say, some detailing, I'm going to use that bolster pillow as an example. I want to translate detailing to this shape to make it something more than just a form. I think along this line, I want to create a stripe, and then I'm going to add like a little frill detail. If I was to just come in and draw lines going straight, it would take all the illusion work that I've done here and flatten it back out. So when I am drawing a pattern, I need to recreate a grid along my form that actually follows the form, which means that this line also becomes curved. This line also becomes curved, and so on and so forth. These lines remain parallel to your surface, to how it sits. But these lines curve, because the curve is found along this point on a cylinder. It is not found along the extension. Now that I have a grid in here, get that just a bit darker, I can figure out, oh, okay, so if this is roughly my center, and I want everything to be centered, as it goes away from me, it's going to be a little bit longer, closer is going to be a little shorter. It's just foreshortening. That's what that means, is like the foreground gets shortened, and as it extends away, it elongates. And then for my frill detail, I'm actually going to come up and out, and I'm actually using another sphere here that fits around my, or sorry, another cylinder here that fits around my first cylinder, but it's very narrow, so I'm just going to sketch in the base, and then I'm going to come in and add in these little arcs that just suggest my frill. This is an easy way to get detailing in your sketches without being too precious about it, so that you have a very accurate sketch. However, it didn't take you years and years to figure out what that looks like. And then you can darken up any of the lines that you want to keep and transfer to tracing paper, etc. Take a picture of it, load it into your digital program. But just making sure that you're following the form increases the likelihood that we're going to see this and think, oh yeah, that's an actual 3D form, and understand what it is. You can also exaggerate what I just talked about, that foreshortening. So if you want it to seem like it's really long, it's going away from you at a steeper angle. A way to do this is, rather than just drawing it longer, is to come in, I'm going to scooch my paper over, draw the same type of ellipses we've been doing. This time though, we are going to use a little perspective trick, and this is single point perspective, which just means that we're drawing towards a fictional point that is off here in the distance. Sometimes you can actually draw a point on your paper and work towards that. Sometimes the point ends up being off your paper. In that case, if you're using a tool to continue to draw that point, I recommend either like taking a piece of tape or a sticky note, putting your dot on it, and putting it the distance away that you need. We'll go over all of these tricks when we start talking about perspective here in Module 2. For now though, you can just put a little dot off, and if you want to be really precious about it, you can use a ruler. Otherwise, you can just sketch in. And you're trying to maintain the same angle here and here. So it's an evenly descending towards a point. The point should be somewhere on your horizon line. So my horizon line follows through the center of my cylinder in this case. Oh, it needs to drop down a little bit. But that's just an area of thumb. We're kind of getting too complicated right now. This level of cylinder is good when you're drawing a lot of different angles of it though. It can be useful to make some of these dots so that you can visualize the angles more easily. Now we want a curve that matches this, but it is going to be much smaller. We can just come in and draw that whole curve and then be like, oh, yep, it does just fit right here though, along that curve. We will darken up our baseline. We will darken, oops, our top line here. And then we can translate another curve coming here, another curve. I like adding in the extra curves because it helps me. And so now I have a fictional point extending here at my horizon line that my cylinder is traveling back towards. This gives me a little bit more space, especially when drawing cylinders. Giving an idea of the space it's sitting in can be really helpful to delineate it from just a wedge. And then if you wanted this to, be a cylinder that kind of curves out at the end, you could even curve your lines here. And now you have like a half circle sitting on the edge. Now it's a very rounded form. Or you can keep them straight and just have a cut face like that. All right, so that's cylinders. Cylinders can also stand upright. I'm going to draw one here. They don't have to be laying down horizontally. When you're drawing a cylinder, you're only going to see two sides. On a sphere, you get one side. It's all one face. Here you're going to get one face here, and you're going to get a second face in this curvature side. You're not going to be able to see the other corresponding face to this at the same time that you can see this space. So there's a theoretical 3 back here, but you can't see it. So you don't need to draw it. If you want to indicate that it's there, say you want to make sure that your cylinder isn't running into something behind it, you can dot in the line. And this is where your space 3 exists. Going back. You want it to be about the same, so I might need to even bring it out just a little bit further. We don't need to necessarily worry about this until we need to start putting shapes together to make a form. Let's go ahead and draw our cylinder vertically. We're going to have the same thing happen, where we only see two sides. So one, I have my ellipses. When it's vertically, it gets like very skinny. So I have my space 1. One there. And then I need to come down, drop down these edges, and then recreate this curve. So I have a line there, a line there, creating this, dropping it down. I might translate in another curve. Sometimes if you have a really long way to go, it's easier to just draw in each section and kind of continue it down. That helps you keep that curve accurate to the top. And there will be some just eyeballing. So I have this here. This is a great way to begin drawing a pedestal or a lampshade. I could even then say, oh, okay, there's another cylinder under here. I don't see the top of it because it's covered by my lampshade. But it comes down and has the same curve here that here. It's along this same axis. And we're looking at it. Oh, and maybe I have another little cylinder coming out like this. That is the knob. And now I've built just a basic lamp and shade just out of cylinders. We're going to get to doing this more in the coming lessons. For now, I just want you to take a look at cylinders and drawing different sizes of cylinders from different angles. Maybe you can see a lot more of your face and your angle comes back extremely sharp, like this. You're going to mostly see cylinders in a 3/4 perspective or somewhere between our 180 and 90. If we're looking at a cylinder that is we're direct face on facing this. It's just a circle. And if we're looking at a cylinder from just this side, we can't see any of these faces. It's actually a rectangle. Because these two lines, you're only seeing one half of the circle. You're only seeing from here to here with your eye. Your eye will flatten it out. It becomes a rectangle. So if we were looking at it perfectly, rectangle, circle, but somewhere between this and this is where we can see the full shape of the cylinder. All right, we're going to move on to cones. I've run out of space here, so I'm going to go on to the next page. So we're ready for cones. All right. Cones are really simple because, once again, they only have two sides that we can see. They actually only have two sides in general because the way that the curvature of a cone works is it's pulled out and comes to an apex point that then just vanishes. It comes to nothing. It does not have a second flat face. It has the round face that is narrowing, and it has a flat face that is a circle. So let's look at our specialty cones. So cones, once again, are going to start with an ellipses most of the time. If we're looking at them just from the bottom, we're once again just looking at a circle. However, if we look at them just a bit from the side, so now we have an ellipses, we can extend this point off in whatever direction our coin is pointing to, or our cone is pointing to. The center, we're just going to draw a line out from it, and then we're going to come from this point. Oh, that line went a little off the rails, out to the end of there. So this is my maximum where my cone disappears off into. And once again, there. The trick here is that I can't actually see any of this line. So my line will actually end up coming from here. But you want to kind of find where your cone is pointing from this point, and you can choose any point. I could draw another cone where I see a lot more of the face and say, okay, I'm going to extend to here. I'm going to bring this here. This actually ends up traveling through, but I can see the outer edge coming from here. So I just have to travel to the nearest point that I can keep my angle pretty consistent and draw a line that falls back to touching the outer edge of my circle. So now I have this here, and I also like to give a few more lines coming out, just communicating how this cone sits in space. This feels a little wonky here. It's partially because I don't have anything else around it helping me make sense of what I can see. Let's do another one, but let's keep the point relatively close. So here I have just the slightest elongation, so I can pull it just a little bit away and come from the edge and the edge to create my cone. So that's a cone shape. If I'm seeing a cone from just the edge, and this, I can't see the flat face, maybe I'm looking at it slightly down, I have a point that's going to come out. I'm going to start from a triangle and just draw that top part of my triangle, and then I'm going to draw curvature of that circle face. So that circle face is actually sitting under here, but my horizon line is above that face, so I can't see it. That's a cone. You communicate the cone by having that curvature. If you looked at it straight on from the side, you get to a triangle. And that's why I say cones sit somewhere in the middle. So like our middle of that face is there, but we have our cone sitting over top. This can be useful for mapping in things like trees, let's see, all sorts of things, different lamp fixtures, bases of chairs. It's a super versatile shape. We don't tend to think of it very often. You can also just, if I said I want to cut off the end of the cone, I could have it like that. And now I have a cone, I've just bisected it, so if I erase these lines, I would have this flat shape. That's one of the cool things about drawing and converting these flat shapes into a 3D shape, is you can begin to get an idea for how to manipulate these forms in your head to fit into the things that we actually see and draw around us. Drawing and practicing these forms just helps us get an idea about how to communicate that spatial effect, make it seem 3D.